The freezing November evening of 1941 found Joseph Stalin in his office in the Kremlin, receiving reports from General Georgy Zhukov that documented the arrival at Moscow's perimeter of fresh divisions from the Far East, whose presence might transform the desperate defensive battle into an opportunity for counteroffensive. The Supreme Commander, who had spent months watching German forces advance relentlessly toward the capital, who had witnessed the destruction of Soviet armies in catastrophic encirclements, who had feared that Moscow itself might fall before adequate reserves could be concentrated, was learning that divisions he had previously withheld in Siberia to guard against potential Japanese attack were now arriving in strength sufficient to enable offensive operations. The intelligence from Richard Sorge in Tokyo that Japan would strike south toward British and American territories rather than north against the Soviet Union had enabled the risky decision to strip forces from the Far Eastern Front and to deploy them westward. The confirmation that these elite, well-equipped, winter-trained divisions were reaching assembly areas around Moscow marked the moment when Stalin recognized that the strategic initiative could shift from German offensive to Soviet counterattack. The background to the Siberian division's arrival traced to Stalin's fundamental strategic dilemma through summer and autumn 1941. The German invasion had shattered Soviet defensive positions across the western frontier, had destroyed armies through encirclements, and had advanced hundreds of kilometers toward Moscow. Soviet reserves called up from interior military districts had been committed to defensive battles and had been consumed without stopping German advance. The question facing Stalin was whether to commit the Far Eastern divisions to the desperate defense of Moscow or to maintain them in the east against the possibility that Japan might attack while the Soviet Union was engaged in existential struggle with Germany. The Far Eastern Front under Marshal Apanasenko comprised over 15 divisions equipped with modern weapons, trained for combat in harsh climates, and blooded through border clashes with Japanese forces in 1938 to 1939 at Khalkhin Gol. The divisions represented substantial military capability, perhaps 1/4 of remaining effective Soviet ground forces. Yet Stalin had refused to weaken Far Eastern defenses despite catastrophic losses in the West. The Soviet Union faced enemies on 2 fronts, and committing Far Eastern forces to fight Germany would leave the eastern borders vulnerable to Japanese attack that could create strategic disaster even if Moscow held. Richard Sorge, the Soviet intelligence agent operating in Tokyo undercover as a German journalist, had transmitted reports through autumn 1941 indicating that Japanese strategic deliberations were focusing on southern expansion rather than on attacking the Soviet Union. Sorge's access to German and Japanese diplomatic and military circles provided intelligence of exceptional value. But Stalin had been cautious about accepting assessments that seemed too convenient. The Supreme Commander had questioned whether Sorge might be compromised, whether Japanese might be conducting deception to lull Soviets into stripping Far Eastern defenses, and whether committing to a single strategic assessment would prove catastrophic if that assessment was wrong. The specific intelligence that Sorge provided through September and October had documented Japanese Imperial Conference decisions to pursue Southern strategy, targeting British, Dutch, and American possessions in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Sorge's reports included details of Japanese military preparations oriented southward, of diplomatic negotiations with the United States that Japanese leadership considered likely to fail, and of planning for operations against the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. The specificity of Sorge's reporting gave it credibility that general assessments would have lacked. Yet Stalin understood that even detailed reports could be part of elaborate deception if Japanese intelligence services had identified Sorge and were feeding him false information. The corroboration that Stalin demanded before accepting Sorge's intelligence came from multiple sources through October. Soviet military intelligence observed Japanese troop movements toward Manchurian ports, consistent with deployments for southern operations rather than for concentration against Soviet borders. Radio intercept analysis detected communications patterns suggesting Japanese naval preparations in home waters rather than in the northern Pacific. Agent reports from multiple locations described Japanese logistics preparations oriented toward tropical operations rather than toward combat in Siberian conditions. The convergence of intelligence from independent sources created confidence that Sorge's reporting was accurate. The decision-making process through which Stalin authorized transfer of Far Eastern divisions reflected the Supreme Commander's characteristic caution combined with recognition of desperate military necessity. Stalin had convened meetings with Shaposhnikov, with Zhukov, and with intelligence chiefs, testing the assessment that Japan would not attack and exploring what minimal forces could remain in the Far East without creating unacceptable risk. The discussions had revealed consensus that maintaining full strength in the Far East while Moscow faced existential threat was unsustainable, but also revealed that completely stripping Far Eastern defenses would be reckless, even if intelligence suggested Japanese attack was unlikely. The compromise that emerged from these deliberations called for transferring approximately two-thirds of Far Eastern divisions westward, while retaining one-third for defensive missions. The remaining forces would be positioned to conduct delaying operations if Japan attacked, buying time for reserves to be rushed eastward if necessary. The compromise reflected Stalin's acceptance that some risk was unavoidable, that perfect security on all fronts was impossible given resources available, and that strategic prioritization required accepting vulnerabilities in secondary theaters to concentrate strength where decisive battles would be fought. The October intelligence from Sorge that Japan had made final decision to strike south toward Southeast Asia and the Pacific rather than north against the Soviet Union had enabled the risky decision to strip forces from the Far Eastern Front and to deploy them westward. The confirmation that these elite, well-equipped, winter-trained divisions were reaching assembly areas around Moscow marked the moment when Stalin recognized that the strategic initiative could shift from German offensive to Soviet counterattack. The elite Siberian division's arrival provided Stalin's fundamental strategic dilemma through summer and autumn 1941. The German invasion had shattered Soviet defensive positions across the western frontier, had destroyed armies through encirclements, and had advanced hundreds of kilometers toward Moscow. Soviet reserves called up from interior military districts had been committed to defensive battles and had been consumed without stopping German advance. The question facing Stalin was whether to commit the Far Eastern divisions to the desperate defense of Moscow or to maintain them in the east against the possibility that Japan might attack while the Soviet Union was engaged in existential struggle with Germany. The Far Eastern Front under Marshal Apanasenko comprised over 15 divisions equipped with modern weapons, trained for combat in harsh climates, and blooded through border clashes with Japanese forces in 1938 to 1939 at Khalkhin Gol. The divisions represented substantial military capability, perhaps 1/4 of remaining effective Soviet ground forces. Yet Stalin had refused to weaken Far Eastern defenses despite catastrophic losses in the West. The Soviet Union faced enemies on two fronts, and committing Far Eastern forces to fight Germany would leave the eastern borders vulnerable to Japanese attack that could create strategic disaster even if Moscow held.
Richard Sorge, the Soviet intelligence agent operating in Tokyo undercover as a German journalist, had transmitted reports through autumn 1941 indicating that Japanese strategic deliberations were focusing on southern expansion rather than on attacking the Soviet Union. Sorge's access to German and Japanese diplomatic and military circles provided intelligence of exceptional value. But Stalin had been cautious about accepting assessments that seemed too convenient. The Supreme Commander had questioned whether Sorge might be compromised, whether Japanese might be conducting deception to lull Soviets into stripping Far Eastern defenses, and whether committing to a single strategic assessment would prove catastrophic if that assessment was wrong. The specific intelligence that Sorge provided through September and October had documented Japanese Imperial Conference decisions to pursue Southern strategy, targeting British, Dutch, and American possessions in Southeast Asia.
General Lev Dovator's cavalry corps, which included units from Siberia, demonstrated mobility in winter conditions that German forces could not match. Dovator's horsemen conducted raids behind German lines, disrupting supply convoys, attacking headquarters, and creating uncertainty about Soviet capabilities that affected German operational planning. The cavalry operations, though tactically limited, demonstrated that Soviet forces were not simply defending desperately, but were capable of offensive action that put German forces on the defensive. Stalin's meetings with Zhukov through late November focused increasingly on when sufficient forces would be assembled to enable counteroffensive, rather than on whether Moscow could be defended. Zhukov reported that Siberian divisions were arriving daily, that these formations were being integrated into defensive positions, and that their presence was stabilizing frontline situations that had seemed desperate. The general briefed Stalin that German offensive toward Moscow was losing momentum, that German forces were exhausted from months of continuous operations, and that winter weather was affecting German mobility more severely than Soviet operations. The specific briefings that Zhukov provided documented the transformation that the Siberian division's arrival was creating. The general reported that the 44th Mongolian Cavalry Division had arrived and had been deployed to conduct reconnaissance and raids that were disrupting German rear areas. The 58th Tank Division, equipped with T-34 tanks and crewed by experienced tankers from the Far East, had arrived and provided armored capability that earlier Soviet defenses had lacked. The 82nd Motorized Rifle Division had been positioned as mobile reserve that could respond to German breakthrough attempts or could exploit opportunities for counterattack. Zhukov's operational planning for counteroffensive incorporated Siberian divisions as the spearhead formations that would conduct initial attacks while second echelon forces exploited any breakthroughs achieved. The planning reflected recognition that Siberian troops' quality and winter capabilities made them ideal for offensive operations in December conditions, that their morale and confidence would be contagious to other Soviet forces, and that their combat effectiveness would maximize results from the limited offensive that Soviet resources could sustain. The November 30th meeting, where Zhukov presented detailed counteroffensive plans to Stalin, marked the moment when the Supreme Commander fully recognized that the strategic situation had shifted from desperate defense to opportunity for counterattack. Zhukov's presentation included force disposition charts showing Siberian divisions positioned for attacks north and south of Moscow, outlined objectives that included driving German forces back from Moscow's immediate vicinity, and provided assessments of German vulnerabilities that Soviet attacks would exploit. Stalin's questions during the briefing focused on whether forces were adequate, whether logistics could support offensive operations, and whether German responses could be contained if counteroffensive did not achieve all objectives.
The authorization that Stalin provided on December 1st for counteroffensive to begin on December 5th to 6th reflected his confidence that Siberian divisions and other reserves provided capability for operations that would achieve strategic objectives. Stalin emphasized to Zhukov that primary objective was to save Moscow by driving German forces beyond artillery range of the city, that secondary objectives of encircling German forces were desirable but not essential, and that preserving Soviet offensive capability for future operations was an important consideration that should prevent pursuit beyond sustainable limits. The intelligence about German operational difficulties that reached Stalin through November complemented reports about Siberian divisions' arrival. German forces attacking toward Moscow were at the end of extended supply lines, were experiencing mechanical failures in cold weather their equipment was not designed for, and were suffering casualties from combat and from cold that reduced combat effectiveness. Soviet intelligence officers reported that German troops lacked winter clothing, that cold weather was causing more casualties than combat in some sectors, and that German morale was declining as the promised quick victory failed to materialize. Marshal Shaposhnikov briefed Stalin on November 29th that sufficient reserves had arrived to enable counteroffensive operations, that Zhukov had developed operational plans for attacks north and south of Moscow designed to encircle German forces closest to the capital. Shaposhnikov's assessment was that Soviet forces now possessed local numerical superiority in sectors where counterattacks would be launched, that German forces were vulnerable to operational-level maneuver because they had exhausted themselves in unsuccessful attempts to capture Moscow, and that timing was optimal because German command would not expect major Soviet offensive during winter.
The December 1st conference where Stalin approved Zhukov's counteroffensive plan reflected the Supreme Commander's recognition that Siberian division's arrival had created opportunity that might not recur. Stalin questioned Zhukov closely about force ratios, about whether reserves were adequate for sustained offensive operations, and about what objectives could realistically be achieved. Zhukov's responses emphasized that counteroffensive would exploit German overextension and exhaustion, that objectives were limited to pushing German forces away from Moscow rather than attempting destruction of entire German armies, and that Siberian divisions provided the fresh, capable troops needed for offensive operations in December conditions. The psychological impact on Soviet forces of seeing Siberian divisions arrive cannot be overstated. Soldiers who had retreated for months, who had seen German forces advance seemingly unstoppably, and who had feared Moscow might fall, now observed fresh divisions deploying with equipment and confidence that suggested the tide might be turning. The arrival demonstrated that the Soviet Union possessed reserves that Germany apparently lacked, that the vast spaces and population of the USSR could generate forces that would eventually overwhelm invaders, and that retreat might transition to counterattack. The December 5th to 6th launch of the Soviet counteroffensive north and south of Moscow employed Siberian divisions as shock troops who spearheaded attacks that drove German forces back from the capital's immediate vicinity. The First Shock Army, which included Siberian formations, attacked north of Moscow and achieved penetrations that threatened German communications. The 10th Army attacked south of Moscow with similar success. The coordinated attacks demonstrated operational capabilities that German intelligence had not credited to Soviet forces after months of defensive defeats. The German response to the Soviet counteroffensive revealed that Wehrmacht forces were unprepared for major Soviet attack during winter. German forces attempted to hold positions but lacked reserves to contain Soviet penetrations, lacked winter equipment to operate effectively in freezing conditions, and discovered that tactical superiority that had characterized summer and autumn fighting disappeared when Soviet forces attacked with numerical superiority and with troops equipped and trained for winter warfare.
The German retreat from Moscow's immediate approaches marked the first significant German setback on the Eastern Front. Stalin's reaction to reports of the counteroffensive's initial success combined satisfaction that Moscow had been saved with recognition that opportunity existed to inflict serious defeats on German forces. The Supreme Commander authorized expansion of counteroffensive objectives, ordering that attacks continue to push German forces farther from Moscow. The expanded objectives reflected Stalin's confidence that Siberian divisions and other reserves provided capability for sustained offensive operations that would transform the strategic situation. The continuation of counteroffensive through December and into January tested whether Soviet reserves were adequate for extended operations. The attacks achieved territorial gains measured in tens and eventually hundreds of kilometers, drove German forces away from Moscow, and demonstrated that the Wehrmacht was not invincible. Yet the offensive also revealed limitations. Soviet forces lacked the mobility and logistics to achieve encirclements of major German formations. German forces conducted fighting withdrawals that preserved combat capability. Soviet casualties mounted as offensive continued beyond initial objectives. The February pause in offensive operations reflected recognition that Soviet forces had achieved strategic objectives of saving Moscow and driving German forces back, but lacked capability to destroy German armies or to advance to pre-war borders. Stalin reluctantly accepted Zhukov's and Shapashnikov's assessments that offensive had reached its culminating point, that further attacks would consume reserves without achieving decisive results, and that consolidating gains and preparing for German summer offensive was prudent strategy. The retrospective assessment of the Siberian division's arrival identified it as a turning point where strategic balance shifted from German offensive to Soviet defensive success and counteroffensive. The divisions had provided the fresh, capable troops needed to stop German advance and to launch counterattacks. Their winter training and equipment had proven decisive advantages in December fighting. Their presence had enabled Stalin to authorize offensive operations that changed the war's psychological and strategic dynamics. The casualties that Siberian divisions suffered in December fighting and subsequent operations were severe, with some formations reduced to fractions of their November strength by February. The losses demonstrated that even elite divisions could be consumed rapidly in sustained combat. Yet the sacrifice had achieved strategic purpose. Moscow had been saved. German forces had been driven back. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility had been broken. The Japanese perspective on the transfer of Soviet divisions from Siberia to Moscow revealed that Sorge's intelligence had been accurate. Japan had indeed decided to strike south. The December 7th Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, occurring after Siberian divisions had already been committed to Moscow battle, validated Stalin's decision to accept Sorge's intelligence. Had Stalin waited for absolute confirmation through Japanese actions before authorizing transfers, the divisions would not have arrived in time to effect Moscow's defense. The risk Stalin had accepted in trusting intelligence from a single source had proven justified.
The operational analysis of how Siberian divisions were employed revealed that Soviet command had learned from earlier disasters to concentrate forces for decisive effect rather than dispersing them across the front. The divisions were not fed piecemeal into defensive battles, but were assembled in operational reserves and committed as coherent formations for counteroffensive. The concentration enabled shock effect that scattered commitment of individual divisions could not have achieved. The comparison between Siberian divisions and units raised in European USSR highlighted advantages that combat experience, proper training, and adequate equipment provided. Siberian divisions had trained together for months or years, had experienced leaders, and possessed institutional knowledge that newly formed divisions lacked. The contrast demonstrated that military effectiveness required not just numbers, but organization, training, and leadership that took time to develop. The impact of winter weather on the December fighting demonstrated that Soviet forces' better adaptation to cold conditions provided tactical advantages that affected operational outcomes. Siberian troops fought effectively in temperatures that immobilized German forces, conducted attacks during weather that German command considered prohibitive for offensive operations, and sustained operations that German logistics, struggling with frozen equipment and fuel, could not support. The intelligence contribution that Sorge's reporting represented extended beyond enabling transfer of Siberian divisions to providing strategic reassurance that allowed Stalin to focus Soviet efforts against Germany without constant fear of Japanese attack from the east. The intelligence permitted single-front war strategy when two-front war might have been fatal, allowed concentration of forces against the main threat, rather than dispersing them to cover multiple contingencies. The recognition by German command that the Soviet Union possessed reserves sufficient to conduct winter counteroffensive came as strategic shock. German intelligence had assessed that Soviet forces were near collapse, that Moscow's fall was imminent, and that winter would simply consolidate German conquests. The appearance of fresh Soviet divisions conducting coordinated offensive operations forced recognition that German planning assumptions about Soviet weakness were wrong, that the war would not be won quickly, and that Germany faced protracted conflict against enemy with greater reserves and staying power. The moment when Stalin learned that Siberian divisions had arrived cannot be identified as a single event because arrivals occurred over weeks as divisions completed rail journeys from the Far East. Yet the period in mid to late November when sufficient divisions had arrived to enable counteroffensive planning represented a critical transition from desperate defense to confident counterattack. Stalin's recognition that strategic situation had shifted was reflected in his authorization of offensive operations and in his confidence that Moscow would not just survive, but would be the launching point for counterattack that would drive German forces back. The final assessment was that the Siberian division's arrival provided Stalin with military capability that transformed Moscow's defense from desperate holding action to launching point for counteroffensive. The divisions brought numbers, quality, winter capability, and morale that enabled operations that would not have been possible with forces that had been fighting since June. The intelligence that enabled their transfer represented strategic decision of highest consequence. The logistics that delivered them demonstrated Soviet organizational capability under crisis conditions, and their combat performance validated that they represented Soviet military capability at its best. Stalin learned through November that the divisions were arriving and recognized that their arrival created opportunity to shift from defense to offense, from retreat to counterattack, from near defeat to survival and eventual victory.